I am Milton Friedman. The current media discussion of our economic problems almost always reminds me of an old saying by a 19th century American humorist, Josh Billings, when he said, "The trouble with people ain't ignorance, it's what they know that ain't so." Well, in the same way, it often seems to me that what the pundits through the news media and through the over your little screen are putting forth is not what's true, not what's right, but what they think is so. In particular, let me be more specific. The three problems that you hear most about over the news media are, first, our current federal budget deficit, the fact that the federal government is spending more than it's taking in. Second, the size of our government debt. And third, the balance of payments deficit. To listen to people talk, you would think that the deficits are going to drive us into bankruptcy or inflation, that the debt is going to bankrupt our children, and that the balance of payments deficit means that we're headed toward becoming a banana republic. In my opinion, all three of these things are false problems. That doesn't mean there aren't real problems. There are, and those are the ones I want to talk about. But these are false problems. Why? First, take the budget deficit. If the federal government spends $1 trillion and takes in what it calls taxes, $800 billion, who do you suppose pays the other $200 billion? You and I do. What are called deficits are simply a form of taxation. They're a bad form of taxation, but they're taxation. They're hidden taxation, either inflation or a tax on our wealth. The real problem, not the false problem, but the real problem is what government spends, how much government spends, and the regulations and impositions that it imposes on all of us. How much of our lives government runs for us. The second problem, the second false problem, is the debt. Now, as it happens, the federal government debt, relative to our national income, is very much smaller now than it was for most of the post-war period. At the end of World War II, the debt, the government public debt, federal government public debt, was over a year's national income. Today, it's around 40% national income. Again, it's too high. I'd like to see it smaller, but it doesn't raise a major problem for us. The third problem, the problem, so-called problem, the problem of the balance of payments deficit, you hear a lot about how foreigners are taking advantage of us, that we somehow have an open market and they have a closed market, and all we're asking for is a level playing field. That is a bunch of arrant nonsense. We have imposed a great many restrictions on foreign trade, as other countries have. We're not angels, and neither are they. The truth is that the real problem, which all this talk conceals, is the problem that is raised for us, for you and me, by the limitations that are placed on foreign trade, by the tariffs, by the quotas, by the other restrictions that keep us from buying goods where we can get them most cheaply and selling our products where we can sell them most dearly. That's the real problem. And that, if we don't get it under control, is capable of doing us a great deal of harm.
Well, Milton, how do you account for these differing public perceptions? Both parties apparently feel they understand the issue correctly.
Oh, it's very easy to account for the different perceptions on the part of Congress. If you're a congressman, what is it that you're aiming for? You're aiming to behave in a way which will get you reelected. Now, it turns out that it's easier to get reelected, on the average, by spending other people's money than it is by saving it. Let me put that more specifically. Here's what looks like a very attractive spending program. Some people are going to benefit a great deal. You and I are going to pay 10 cents extra in taxes a year to pay for it. Are you going to go down and lobby your congressman not to pass that spending program? Not at all. But the people who are going to benefit greatly from it, they're going to be down there lobbying for it. Let me give you a very, very simple example. Every housewife in this country pays 4 to 5 times the world price for a pound of sugar. If she were able to buy that sugar on the world market, it would cost a fifth of what it now costs. Why can't she? Well, there are a few 100,000 farmers who grow sugar beets. some who grow cane for sugar. Between them, they have been able to persuade the Congress to put a quota on imports of sugar from abroad. Now, those sugar quotas do the consumers a great deal of harm. They help 100, 200,000, maybe, I don't know what the exact number is, maybe it's more, maybe it's less, but a very small number, who bring great pressure to bear on the Congress to keep the quotas. Once those quotas are in effect, once sugar has become expensive, it turns out that there are more special pleaders, because then it turns out that with sugar that expensive, natural sugar, various kinds of artificial sugar like sucrose made from corn can be produced more cheaply than the artificial price of the sugar, though more expensively than the world price. The result of that is that the producers of that kind of sucrose join the lobbyists who are lobbying for an import quota. And the end result is that the consumers are quiet, the producers and those who are affected are loud, and it gets passed. Now, what's Congress going to do about it? It doesn't like the deficit. But in fact, the easiest way to get out of that deficit is to raise taxes rather than to lower spending. But if you listen to what I said before, that doesn't do any good from the point of view of the consumer. You pay for it one way or another. The real question is, how much are you required to spend one way or another, directly or indirectly, by taxes, by lending, by inflation? What fraction of your income are you required to devote to having other people spend it supposedly on your behalf?
Well, I understand the sense in which politicians have a benefit from the way they act, but how do you explain other scholars, other intellectuals who draw conclusions that are different from yours?
Well, they don't. I don't believe that's the case. I think if you ask any scholar whether the burden imposed on government is better measured by what government spends, that isn't the best way of measuring it either. Take the case of the sugar quotas. Government doesn't spend a great deal of money on imposing those quotas, but you and I spend a great deal of money in paying the higher price for sugar. But go back. Suppose you ask the scholars, which is a more nearly correct measure of the impact of government, what government spends or what it takes in tax receipts. There's no doubt that almost all scholars would agree that it's what government spends. The place where there is a difference of opinion is how serious a deficit will be. And the crucial difference there is not a difference of logic or analysis, but a difference of political judgment. Let me explain. Most of the people who argue for higher taxes to eliminate the deficit implicitly assume that imposing higher taxes would eliminate the deficit. I don't assume that at all. If higher taxes would eliminate the deficit, why haven't we gotten rid of the deficit long ago? Taxes have been going up for 50, 60 years. The fraction of income taken in taxes by the federal government has gone from something like 3% to nearly 10 times, well, not quite, to about 20% now, over the course of the period from 1930 to now. So if higher tax receipts could eliminate the deficit, we wouldn't have a deficit. My belief is that if taxes somehow by magic, suppose last year, tax receipts had by magic suddenly been $100 billion higher than they were, my own belief is that the main effect would have been that government would have spent more. Maybe not 100 billion more, maybe 80 or 90 billion more, but almost the whole of it. That was certainly demonstrated in 1982 when President Reagan agreed to a deal with Congress under which he was promised that there would be $3 of spending cuts for every dollar of tax increase. As the thing worked out, there was in fact $3 of tax increase for every dollar of spending cut. So I think the difference in views reflects mainly, shall I say, a difference of cynicism or a difference of how much we believe what politicians say.
Well, I assume, it's obvious that the quality and quantity of the information that one has would have an impact on one's perception as to solutions. What about Tom Sowell's idea that there is this basic conflict of visions, that there are people that have a view of the world that affects their judgment on these matters?
There undoubtedly are such views. There are people who believe that it is desirable for government to be larger. No doubt. And with them, there's a straightforward argument between people who believe that way and people who believe the way I do. Let me go back over that a little. The plain fact is that every citizen of the United States, every resident of the United States, on the average works from January 1st to sometime in June to pay the expenses of government before he can start working to pay directly what he wants to spend himself.
Now, is that total government, federal, state?
That's federal, state, and local. That's all the way through. I'm glad you added that. 2/3 of it is federal, 1/3 about local. Now, there would be nothing wrong with that if people felt that they were getting their money's worth for what they are spending. But I believe it's very hard to find any large number of people who would say they're getting their money's worth. That, of course, leads you to the question of how do you explain all these polls in which people say they don't want government to cut down spending? The answer to that is very easily. Everybody believes that the government spends too much in total, but very few believe that the government spends too much on the particular projects that interest them. So each one separately is going to defend his own turf. And the real problem is how do you get a package deal under which they'll all agree to cut down what they separately believe they're benefiting from. I keep saying believe they're benefiting from because most cases they really aren't benefiting. They are to begin with, but then it goes away. Take these sugar producers. If there had never been any quotas, they wouldn't be any worse off than they are now. They would simply be doing something different. They'd be growing a crop that could stand on its own feet in the market and wouldn't have to have government support. They would be getting about the same income for their labor and for their capital and so on. But once they're in sugar, once they've got capital sunk in sugar, there's no doubt that the elimination of those quotas would hurt them.
Pursuing just a bit further this question of differences of viewpoint, using yourself as an example, do you recall having a different outlook of policy issues than your high school friends?
No, I don't. Now, remember, that goes a long way back. I was in high school from 1924 to 1928. But then I was in college from 1928 to 32. And of course, that was a period of the Great Depression. I graduated from college at just the very depths of the Great Depression. And at that time, there was an enormous amount of concern about the economy, about whether there was something fatally flawed with the economy. And I have no doubt, though it's very hard for me to reconstruct at this distance, what my thoughts were then. Well, I have no doubt that I joined with my fellow students in sort of believing that somehow government had to do something about it, and I think government did. I think in an emergency like that, even though I later found out and later discovered that that Great Depression was produced by government error, by mistakes made by government, even so, given the situation you were in 1932 and 33, I have no doubt that it was desirable for government to step in and take some emergency measures.
Well, were your mother and father at all interested in these public policy issues?
Not at all. My mother and father were immigrants from Europe. My mother came over when she was 14 years old. My father came over when he was, I think, 16 or 17 years old. They met over here, got married. My mother started working in a sweatshop running a sewing machine in a sweatshop. And when I was growing up, they had a very small retail business in a small town. I doubt that our family as a whole ever had an income that would have risen above what's now called the poverty level, or even a very small fraction of that. And they had enough to do trying to keep body and soul together. They may have been interested in some issues, but I never recall discussions at home about problems of public policy. But again, let me recall that I really, to all intents and purposes, left home in 1928 when I went off to college, and by that time my father had died, as a matter of fact. My mother was a sole support, and she ran the store which had been the family store.